Our speaker for tonight, her name is Emily Sneff, and she's a Ph.D. candidate at William and Mary in Williamsburg. The past year, she was the Cincinnati Barra Dissertation Fellow at the McNeil Center for Early American Studies at Penn. Her dissertation, when the Declaration of Independence was news, examines the dissemination of the Declaration of Independence around the Atlantic world in 1776. Before graduate school, Emily was the research manager of the Declaration Resources Project at Harvard University. She received her BA in History from Johns Hopkins University and her MA in History from William and Mary. Okay, so I'd like you to welcome her. You're right here.
I need everybody in this room to turn the Wi-Fi off on their phone because the Wi-Fi in this building is a bit sensitive. And the first thing to drop out is audio. For our friends on Zoom, which we have quite a few this evening, you are doing them a very kind favor. So just turn your Wi-Fi off.
No, it's okay.
Don't know how? Turn your phone off. The airplane mode does not count. You still are connecting to Wi-Fi. Yes, it just cuts you off from cellular.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for the warm introduction. Can everyone hear me okay? Good? Okay. It's a little tinny. Okay. So I'm here tonight to talk to you all about the Declaration of Independence, which I'm sure is something that this room knows quite a bit about already. So I thought I would start with sort of the bare essentials of the Declaration, the things that I think. Hello? Sorry. The things that I think everyone, whether there's in Philadelphia or existing in the United States, needs to know about the Declaration. That means myths or misinformation or just almost 250 years. Then, if you'll allow me, I thought I would zoom out a little further than that and talk more specifically about what I know the most about when it comes to the Declaration, which is what was happening in 1776. So basically Philadelphia as the center of this massive information network that takes the Declaration all over the world. So if you have questions, anything doesn't seem clear, just let me know, and I'm happy to double back or clarify.
Whoever's phone that is, Zoom people heard your ringtone now.
Okay, very good. Right. So there are essentials about the Declaration of Independence. You all obviously know that the Continental Congress was meeting in Philadelphia in 1776. I normally start my timeline of events with May 15th. That's the day that the Continental Congress passes a resolution they actually agreed to on May 10th. And then John Adams added a pretty feisty preamble to it, and they approved that not unanimously on May 15th. And that resolution called for every colony that hadn't done so already to eliminate their royal government and replace it with a more representative government. That is interpreted by some as a Declaration of Independence or not quite a Declaration of Independence. So it gets people in the mindset of what a Declaration of Independence might look like. From there, we have to go to Williamsburg, and I apologize. I promise I'm from here. I would rather tell a story completely about Philadelphia. Yes. Most of them had not actually finalized them yet. New Hampshire was in January 1776 working on a constitution, and they reached out to the Continental Congress and asked, what do we do? How do we create a new government? So it was as of the late spring of 1776, A number of colonies were already working on constitutions, had already called constitutional conventions, but some had not started yet, including Pennsylvania. They start because of the May 15th resolution. But that's a good point that segues me to Williamsburg, where they were having a constitutional convention. So also on May 15th, the Virginia Convention passes its own resolution, right? These cities are very far apart. I've done the drive. It takes 6 hours in a good car. It took 10 days in 1776. But in Williamsburg, they passed a resolution sending new instructions to their delegates in Philadelphia, and it's a three-part set of instructions. They want them to declare independence, to create a plan for treaties with foreign countries, and to create a plan of confederation, prioritizing the sovereignty of every colony. So those instructions are passed in Williamsburg on May 15th. It takes about 10 days for them to get to Philadelphia. At the time that this news arrives, George Washington is here. He's having a meeting with the entire Congress. They don't present the resolutions right away. They do it on June 7th. You may know them as the Lee Resolution, right? Richard Henry Lee, on behalf of the Virginia delegation, presents these new instructions. And in that order, we should declare independence, create a plan for foreign treaties, and create a plan of confederation. That's on June 7th. The next day is Saturday. They spend the entire day debating. They take off on Sunday, and they come back on Monday, and they decide to postpone any vote on independence by 3 weeks. So that's Monday, July 10th. They're postponing it to Monday, June 10th. They're postponing to Monday, July 1st. In those 3 weeks, they don't want to be behind if they do decide to declare independence. So that's why they select a committee. We know it is the Committee of Five: Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Robert R. Livingston, and Roger Sherman. And they're supposed to draft a declaration. They do not need 3 weeks to draft a Declaration of Independence. It's 1,300 words. They don't need 3 weeks. But they're given that time, and they probably end up spending a couple of days over those 3 weeks working on the declaration. At the same time, there are committees that are chosen to draft Articles of Confederation and a model foreign treaty. So these three documents are working together. Together, they're going to be the articulation of what does our new independent country look like. It's just that the declaration ends up being passed first. So on June 28th, the Committee of Five delivers its draft to Congress. If you see those memes that say July 3rd and Thomas Jefferson says, oh crap, that's due tomorrow. It's not quite right. They had it ready on June 28th, which was the Friday before the debate was supposed to begin. Congress spends the 1st and 2nd of July debating whether to declare independence. On July 1st, John Dickinson gives, by account of his notes, a really powerful speech advising that we should confederate and get France's thoughts on whether we should declare independence before doing so. John Adams gives a fiery speech. Ultimately, the side of independence wins out. So in the middle of the day on July 2nd, Congress votes and declares independence. We know they declare independence during the day because the news actually makes it into the newspaper that evening, which is very, very rare in early American newspapers. Benjamin Town had a tri-weekly evening newspaper called the Pennsylvania Evening Post. And he printed it on Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays. So on Tuesday, July 2nd, he quickly added a blurb on the last page of the news saying that Congress had declared independence. So that news starts to spread. On July 3rd and 4th is when Congress debates and edits the Declaration of Independence. And they make pretty significant edits to the text. Thomas Jefferson is the principal author of the Declaration. He wrote the first draft. John Adams and Ben Franklin contributed bits and pieces. John Adams thinks he contributed more than Thomas Jefferson thinks he contributed. We don't exactly know what Robert R. Livingston or Roger Sherman contributed to it, but we know what the draft looks like when the committee is done with it, and we know what it looks like when it's printed. And the most significant change, which I'm guessing you've heard before, is there was an additional grievance in the list of 27 grievances At the end of the list, there was one that blamed King George III for the transatlantic slave trade. So the text is edited pretty heavily, just kind of refined, and the word count is brought down, and they end up passing the text on July 4th. That night, the declaration goes to the printer, John Dunlap, whose shop was where the Continental was. Rest in peace, Continental. John Dunlap spends July 4th, the night of July 4th into the 5th, printing broadsides. So a broadside would be a large poster-sized copy of the Declaration that would be really good for public readings. So someone could stand up there with a big copy, but it could also be posted up on the sides of buildings or distributed through the mail. So it's a really useful copy of the Declaration. We don't know how many he printed. He had to have printed a couple hundred just for the bare minimum. We have to send it to all the officers in the Army so they can read it to their soldiers. We have to send it to every colony. We have to send it to the governors of Caribbean nations that we hope might support us. There was, if you're thinking about like a guest list, there was a pretty long list of just the bare essentials, have to send a copy to them. And then we know that people purchased broadsides on top of that. So we can assume that the Dunlap broadside got some distribution that way. We actually know that it did because Dunlap had a second printing office in Baltimore, and he printed some broadsides that at the bottom, instead of saying Philadelphia printed by John Dunlap, it says Baltimore printed by John Dunlap. So that must have been for commercial use. That one is actually in the National Archives in London because it was intercepted by a British officer and ended up there. So Dunlap broadsides.
If anyone has questions, if you could please repeat them.
Yes, sure.
Because no one on Zoom can hear the questions at all.
No problem.
Thank you.
So the question was, how many Dunlap broadsides are left? Do you want to guess how many are left? There are 26 Dunlap broadsides left. The most recent one was uncovered in the National Archives in London, I think about 10 years ago. And that one was actually sent by a Jewish merchant here in Philadelphia to someone in Europe, and it was intercepted. So it's in the intercepted papers in the National Archives. For other broadsides, we have a better paper trail of kind of where they've gone since 1776, descended through families, that sort of thing. So that's the first printing. The second printing is possibly German. We know that almost immediately, the German printers in town were working on a broadside of the Declaration of Independence because there was a massive, very politically engaged German community here. So within the first couple of days, there's a broadside in German. The second dated copy that we know was printed that date is a newspaper. It's Benjamin Towne's Pennsylvania Evening Post. So since he published on Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays, Thursday, July 4th, he didn't have anything to print, but Saturday, July 6th, he had the Declaration of Independence in there. John Dunlap printed the Declaration in his newspaper on Monday, July 8th. Now, when I say Monday, July 8th, to a room of Philadelphia tour guides, I'm hoping that rings some bells. That's the day of the first public reading of the Declaration, not just in Philadelphia, but in every county seat in Pennsylvania. So the Pennsylvania, local officials, they know about the Declaration before any other colony does. And so they're able to schedule public readings for an election day that's already set for Monday, July 8th. So at noon on Monday, July 8th, just picture in Easton, in Philadelphia, all across the counties, there's public readings of the Declaration. Those are the first, but not the only public readings. And those are the first broadside in the newspaper, but not the only ones. Every Philadelphia newspaper prints the Declaration. So over that next week, it makes its way into all of the active newspapers at that moment. And the news spreads all through the colonies. On July 19th, that's the next sort of key date, the Continental Congress decides to create a parchment copy of the Declaration for everyone to sign. They're thinking about formality. They're thinking about the official papers of European states. And so they want a parchment copy that's going to look different than a paper Dunlap broadside. And believe me, paper produced in wartime Philadelphia is not great. The newspapers, when you look at them in the archives, they're literally falling apart. John Dunlap, for his newspaper, I think like 2 weeks before the Declaration of Independence, he was actually printing on blue cartridge paper. So that's the blue paper that you wrap around a big stack of white paper. So these are not clean looking copies. So that makes it even more important to have a sort of formal copy of the Declaration. So that parchment takes a little bit of time to prepare. It's engrossed or copied out in a really large, clear hand by Timothy Matlack, who's very engaged in local politics at that time. And the parchment is ready by August 8th. Sorry, I have 8 in my head. August 2nd. August 2nd. So the signing of the Declaration begins on August 2nd. Most of the delegates sign that day, but not all of them. Again, there's some evidence that we can see right on the page. In the list of Virginia delegates, which is sort of in the middle underneath John Hancock's signature, the order goes Richard Henry Lee, George Wythe, Thomas Jefferson, and on with the rest of the delegates. Richard Henry Lee and George Wythe were not in Philadelphia on August 2nd. Thomas Jefferson left room above his name for his friends and mentors and who he thought were the leaders of the Virginia delegation to add their names. So I normally say, as sort of the quick timeline, we voted for independence on July 2nd. Congress approved the Declaration of Independence on July 4th. The first printing is July 4th to 5th. And then the parchment signing begins on August 2nd. The last person to sign is Thomas McKean, former governor of Pennsylvania. He definitely signs after January 1777, possibly as late as 1781. So unlike the Constitution, which was all signed on one day, and we know that because John Dickinson was sick and had someone sign his name for him, the Declaration was signed over the course of not just weeks, but years potentially. So I tend to talk about the parchment as sort of timeless in the worst sense of that word, right? Because we have printed copies that we know exactly when they were created. They have the date on them, very definitive timeline. But because we see in Congress July 4th, 1776 on the parchment, we presume that the Declaration was signed on July 4th. It's a very easy assumption for generations of Americans to make, right? But the reality is much more complicated and much more interesting when we think about why did they want to create a copy to sign? Why did people sign it? Why did Robert R. Livingston, who helped to write it, never sign it? Because he never returned to Congress after that. Why did Charles Carroll of Carrollton, who was elected to the Continental Congress on July 4th, was not a member yet? Why did he get to sign it? He becomes the last living signer, and he didn't do anything in the debate. He wasn't even there, right? So I think when we really get into the nitty gritty, the timeline of what happened, the timeline of who was in Philadelphia at what moment, it reveals a much more interesting story. The parchment, of course, is now in the National Archives in Washington, D.C. It has taken quite a journey to get there. It would have stayed in the papers of the Continental Congress with the Secretary, Charles Thompson, through the 1780s. So that means wherever Congress went, wherever Charles Thompson went, the Parchment Declaration went to. And that means Philadelphia, but it also means York, Baltimore, all over the places they tried to find a safe place to meet. And then finally in New York. Then it's handed over to the State Department. And does anyone know who the first Secretary of State was? Someone very invested in the Declaration of Independence's future. So it's just ironic that he ends up being, sort of the steward for the Declaration when his offices are kind of where the Lit building is. So if we imagine, the Declaration living there for a little while, then it stays with the State Department for a long time. It avoids fires. It's displayed on, walls facing windows. It's really not well taken care of. The last time that it's in Philadelphia is the centennial. It's brought up here especially for the celebration here. And actually, because it's brought to Philadelphia, it avoids a massive fire at the building where it would normally be stored in DC. So you never know. And it stays in the State Department for a while and then eventually transfers to the Library of Congress and then to the National Archives when they are created. And that's where it lives today in very faded fashion. So that's the very basic sort of the essentials that I think you need to know about the Declaration. Before I move on to more fun stories, does anyone have any questions? Anything I can clarify? Yeah.
I thought Button Gwinnett was the last.
Button Gwinnett, was he the last to sign? No, he was. So the signatures in order on the parchment from left to right go from south to north, very confusingly. So when we think about the signing process, John Hancock signed first in the middle of the page. He didn't sign his name big enough for the king to read it without his glasses because the king would have never seen the parchment unless things went south really quickly. He signed his signature the way he always signed his signature. The problem is that the next person to sign was Josiah Bartlett of New Hampshire, the northernmost state, at the top of sort of the right column of signatures. And Josiah Bartlett has a very, very small signature. And then everyone kind of signed at the scale of Bartlett's signature. And then when they got done, Hancock's looks massive compared to everyone else's. So Button Gwinnett is last in terms of Georgia being the southernmost state. So it's sort of on its own on the side, but Button Gwinnett actually died a year after signing the Declaration in a duel. So it's possible that he died before Thomas McKean ever signed it. But he is the most rare signature, I believe, of the signers because he died so soon after. So, yeah. Are there any declarations in England now from that time period? Yes. So it's a good question. The Continental Congress has no intention of sending the Declaration to England because in England, it's interpreted as a declaration of war. The Continental Congress would argue we've been at war for a while. But in the law of nations, if you declare war, then you need to inform those people that you've declared war. So the Declaration actually takes a different route as opposed to their earlier petitions where they had sent 2 copies on 2 different ships with representatives from Congress to formally present them to the king. That's what they did with the Olive Branch petition a year before the Declaration, and the king refuses to read it. So after that experience, and because they're presenting themselves as an independent country, they have no intention of sending a copy to the king. They don't think they need to. Their focus is on France. They want France as an ally. So they try to send a copy to their sort of pseudo ambassador who's in Paris. That copy is thrown overboard to prevent interception by the British. It's very complicated in early diplomatic history when you have an ocean and wartime travel and ships getting intercepted and very messy. So they have no plans to send it to London, but the Declaration, the act of declaring independence, coincides with the arrival of the King's Commissioners for Restoring Peace. That's 2 brothers, General William Howe and Vice Admiral Richard Howe. General William Howe was the one who occupied Boston. He's been in Halifax, Canada for a while, and he sails down to New York. And then his brother sails to meet him, leading a massive fleet of British reinforcements and foreign mercenaries, which we normally call Hessians, right? Because the majority of them came from Hesse. So because of that, they have all these British ships hanging out in New York Harbor all of a sudden, including mailboats that are anxious to sail back to London with news that the King's Commissioners have reached New York. So the Declaration, within a week, is on a British mailboat headed for London. So the Declaration is printed in newspapers in the middle of August in London, August 16th and 17th. It's in all the newspapers. And that's how the news spreads to Europe, because the copy that they intended to send to their diplomatic agent in Paris never makes it. So imagine London is interpreting the Declaration of Independence for everyone else. Not exactly what Congress would have chosen. So maybe they should have had a formal plan of sending a copy to London. In addition to that, there's broadsides that British officers intercept here, and they send back to the secretaries of state in their correspondence. So we have multiple Dunlap broadsides that are in the British National Archives in London. And then later in 1778, when Parliament is debating what to do about the war, there's a manuscript copy that's produced that's actually in the parliamentary archives. So that's someone in Parliament transcribing the text. But there's never a copy signed by anyone in Congress that makes its way over to Britain. Yeah.
Is there any sample discussion about slave trade before the committee filed?
Sure. So the question is there any discussion in Britain about the slave trade in the Committee of Five? Right. So the question is there any record basis of what any evidence? Unfortunately, not as much as we would like. John Adams and Thomas Jefferson are both very long-lived. They both die on the 50th anniversary of the Declaration. Neither of them are taking detailed notes in June 1776. James Madison did that for the Constitutional Convention, but we have no equivalent for the Continental Congress. So both John Adams and Thomas Jefferson record their recollections of what happened much later in their lives, at which point they're frenemies. So their perspectives are a little biased by everything that's transpired between the two, and just the fact that they have much more diplomatic and political experience by the time they're writing their autobiographies of what happened. So there, even within that, there's no real conversation about what the committee might have discussed about this particular grievance on the transatlantic slave trade. There are snippets that we can kind of read into. So John Adams more than likely created, what we know, he created a copy of the rough draft, of Jefferson's rough draft. And we are pretty sure that he sent it home to his wife, Abigail, and that she would have read the draft declaration and then read the final version. I should note that by the time she read the final version, she had been inoculated for smallpox along with her children. So it was a very tense time in the Adams family in July 1776. But in her letter to John, where she tells him that she's inoculated his children against smallpox, but he's pretty sure he would be okay with it. She says, I've just read the declaration, and she regrets that some of the more manly sentiments had been cut. So we can assume, because we know that the Adamses were not slaveholders, and we know that Abigail was pretty progressive in her thinking, that she's talking about that 28th grievance. And she's suggesting that, that there's no mention of slavery is something that she wishes had made it into the final version, but we don't know for certain. So I wish that we had more evidence, because that grievance is something that especially educators have really latched onto as an opportunity to talk about the hypocrisy of the Declaration. I will say, and the reason I went to Britain initially with your question, is the first critiques of the Declaration of Independence happen in Britain, and they happen immediately. So as the text circulates through newspapers, there are editorials written, essays. In the Scots magazine, which is printed in Edinburgh, they have a very, very long footnote about the second sentence of the Declaration. They have a little asterisk, and then the author goes on and on about the second sentence. But in Britain, they do call out the hypocrisy of all men are created equal. And they literally say the Continental Congress includes slaveholders. So how dare they say all men are created equal when we are offering an opportunity for freedom to enslave people through the Dunmore Proclamation, which is the governor, the royal governor of Virginia, Lord Dunmore. He offers that any enslaved laborers who join the British will receive their freedom if they fight for the British. So that hypocrisy is there right from the beginning. It's acknowledged right from the beginning, but we don't have as clear a record of why that particular grievance got cut as I wish we had. Yep.
So it did get cut.
Yes, so that grievance did get completely cut.
Where did it get cut?
That grievance got cut when they presented it to Congress. So the Committee of Five made very minimal edits. Franklin and Adams suggested a word here or two, but they didn't make any significant edits like cutting an entire grievance. So that happens in Congress. And like I said, we have the sort of retrospective perspectives that claim that it's the Southern colonies who are saying we can't have this grievance in here, but we don't know for sure. We don't have any record. You know, I wish we had a letter from someone in Congress at that time to someone saying, we had this grievance about this specific thing, and here are the specific issues that everyone had with it, the way that we do for other resolutions and the Articles of Confederation and, you know, debates that were ongoing. But what's important to remember is this was a very tense moment and very busy for the Continental Congress. So Thomas Jefferson was pulling from all sorts of different drafts that he had written for other things and things he had read. He later says it's an expression of the American mind, right? That he's kind of collaborating with other authors and with his own authorship of other things to create this declaration for which he has no model. So mercenaries, insurrections, which risings of enslaved people, and attacks by, quote, merciless text. So to have the transatlantic slave trade after that, and also to blame the king for that, it's a little stickier. Not that all of the grievances are completely justified. They are exaggerating things for effect, or, you know, kind of making issues to be much bigger and much longer term than the reality. But I think that particular grievance, it was probably not worth trying to edit down, and better to just excise it completely. Yes.
How many were not in
So of the 56 signers, how many were not there? So there's 3 different days when they could, or 4 different days when they could not be there. So I'll go in order. June 28th, the day that the committee presents its draft to Congress. That's the day that's memorialized in John Trumbull's painting of the Declaration of Independence, right? Because the Committee of Five is standing there with their copy of the Declaration to present. Most of the people who were in Trumbull's painting were in the room, but not all. And there are guides online where you can see, sorry. There are guides online to the painting where it's sort of labeled with who was there and who wasn't there. There's some delegates that are depicted in that painting very prominently who weren't actually in the room. Then on July 2nd, for the vote for independence, the people notably absent from that particular day, John Dickinson, the Pennsylvania moderates who decided that for the sake of things moving forward, they would sit out the vote entirely. Robert Morris is there, he votes against it, he ends up signing later. So everyone kind of made their own decisions. But so there are some notable absences on that day of people who never returned to Congress. On July 4th, I don't know if I have the exact number, there's definitely fewer than 56 people in the room. And there are definitely people missing from that debate about the Declaration who, you know, you would kind of anticipate would be there. Richard Henry Lee and George Wythe among them. It's odd that Richard Henry Lee proposes independence and then returns to Virginia, right? That doesn't seem to make sense when we know how momentous the Declaration is. but his priority was the Virginia Constitution. And a lot of men had that same priority. John Jay very easily could have been in Congress for all of these votes. His priority was the New York Constitution and just the general governance of New York while the British fleet is expected any day and chaos is reigning. So I would say off the top of my head, in terms of how the signers, the 56 men, how many of them were in Congress on July 4th? Some delegations are totally complete, like all the Massachusetts guys are there, New Hampshire guys are there. Some are really missing significant. New Jersey, they decide to elect a totally new slate of delegates. And they all show up on July 1st. I think Francis Hopkinson came on June 28th, but everyone else shows up on July 1st. So there's constant coming and going. And we can do our best kind of approximation of who was actually there and when. If I'm remembering correctly, I think 44 people signed the Declaration on August 2nd, somewhere in the 40s. And there's 56 signatures total. So, within a couple of days, people signed as they returned to town, but other people, it took time.
Some that were elected on July 4th.
Yes, so the Pennsylvania delegation changes significantly because of the moderates not supporting independence. So there's a whole bunch of new, I think there's 5 new Pennsylvania. Oh, sorry, yes.
And which, by the way, they thank you on Zoom for doing that.
Okay.
They're getting a lot of applause for that.
So the Pennsylvania delegation, like Benjamin Rush, people who were elected to Congress after July 4th, where is their attendance and all this? So the Pennsylvania delegates, their list kind of balloons suddenly because they have all these new delegates. So yes, Benjamin Rush, and I think there's 5 delegates total who are added there. Matthew Thornton is an interesting example because he's a representative of New Hampshire, and he is not elected to Congress until the fall. And he arrives in Philadelphia in November and signs the Declaration. And because the states signed an order and started with New Hampshire, Massachusetts did not leave any room for any more New Hampshire delegates to sign. So Matthew Thornton's name is actually at the bottom of that list of sort of all the New England states, kind of on its own. And now completely faded to oblivion because that was the side of the parchment that got the most damage over time. But he, was months away from being a member of Congress. But that's where signing is a really interesting part of the history because there was an idea that you were committing your name to the cause, even if you weren't a part of the process. But that also means that men like Robert R. Livingston, who were very involved in the process, kind of get left off our list of founders because their names aren't there. So it's a weird sort of chemistry when you're talking about the history of the Declaration. We value signatures, antiquarians and auction houses. We want those signers, we want to cut their signatures off of letters and things to, really focus on the signatures. But I think it's more interesting to focus on the timing and where people were and what their priorities were. Sure. Yeah.
Could you touch on Catherine Goddard's role?
So Mary Catherine Goddard's role. So you're right, I should have taken my timeline a little bit further. So Baltimore, January 1777, Congress has evacuated Philadelphia, and they decide to create a printed copy of what's on the parchment. So the text plus the names of the signers. And they enlist Mary Catherine Goddard, who is the printer and postmistress in Baltimore, to print these broadsides. And the goal is these broadsides would be sent to each of the states to form the foundation of their archive. So most of the Goddard broadsides are still in the state archives of wherever they went, not all of them, but most of them. So she takes some time to prepare the broadsides, and then John Hancock sends them out to every state with a really beautiful letter. All of these, the correspondence of 18th century is just really fascinating to read. But this particular letter, written at a time when Congress isn't super confident about what might happen next, the hopefulness of sending out these copies with the names of the signers, making that list public. The list is made public when the journals of the Continental Congress are published on an annual basis, but the Goddard broadside is the first time that the names of the signers are being publicized in a way that could potentially be dangerous if the war doesn't go Congress's way. And Goddard, of course, has her name at the bottom too. And she's a woman. She was unmarried. Her brother was, I shouldn't be too disparaging of him. Her brother, William Goddard, was a printer too. It was the family business. He tried to launch a paper in Philadelphia. It caused a lot of drama, including Benjamin Town and Joseph Galloway, way too much to try to get into. But William Goddard, he's always moving on to the next thing and kind of leaving things behind. He comes up with a new plan for a postal system for the United States, or the United Colonies at the time. He's always busy. Mary Catherine Goddard, I think of as steady. So every time he leaves his newspaper to go off and do a new thing, she takes over. And that happens in Baltimore. So that means that in July 1776, she's running her brother's newspaper, running it very well, prints the news of the Declaration, adds every special character in her set of type around this little box of news saying that the Continental Congress has declared independence. She does skip over one of the grievances when she's printing it in her newspaper, because if you've read the Declaration, the list of grievances gets a little repetitive because they all start with "he has." So you can easily lose track. I don't blame her or her typesetter for that at all. So she's already printed the Declaration once, and then she prints these broadsides. The difference, though, is in her newspaper, she prints it under M.K. Goddard, and the broadside she prints under Mary Catherine Goddard. So most people, when they look at the Declaration that she printed, get the sense that she was adding her name. If treason is the consequence for these 55 other guys, because Thomas McKean hadn't signed yet, then I'm going to add my name too. So she's a really fascinating woman. She had an enslaved laborer who she emancipated in her will, who became a property owner in Baltimore. I wish we knew more about her actual process of printing the parchment. She also prints the list of signers out of order because she, like most English-speaking, English-reading people, was reading from left to right. So since Georgia is the first state on the left, she went from left to right, top of the column to the bottom of the column. And that threw the order completely off because the Congress had signed from right to left, north to south in each column. So if you look at her broadside, you'll notice that the states are kind of out of order, not in their geographical order. So that's how we know that she was looking at the parchment when she created this broadside. It's not like someone created a list of names to give to her. And it speaks to a really contentious time for Congress being evacuated from Philadelphia. Yeah. So did Goddard try to duplicate the signatures or just print the names? She just printed the names. There are later copies that do try to replicate the signatures. Those are more decorative, that come out in sort of the 1810s, where they have the technology at that point to more accurately reflect the signatures. That's actually a good opportunity for me to quickly mention a different copy of the Declaration that's I'll preface this by saying it's a very confusing copy. We don't have all the puzzle pieces to understand this copy yet. But since it has become kind of my claim to fame in the field, I always feel obliged to talk about it. There's a parchment of the Declaration that is in the West Sussex Record Office in England. It's in Chichester. If you're ever looking for a nice English country city to visit, highly recommend Chichester. It's lovely. But this parchment is the opposite direction of the one that's in the National Archives. It's horizontal instead of vertical. And it has the text of the Declaration handwritten on it. And at the bottom is a list of signatures. And it's not trying to replicate the signers. It's not trying to give the style of their signatures. But because it's handwritten, it looks different. than just a printed list of names. So from the best of our sort of piecing together very disparate evidence, we think that this was a copy of the Declaration that was produced around the time of the Constitutional Convention. So we know it isn't from 1776 because it has Thomas McKean's name on it. And we think it's from about a decade later, and that it was produced here because it was probably copied from the parchment, the signed parchment. And we think maybe it was produced because multiple delegates at the Constitutional Convention were drawing on the Declaration, the principles of equality, the hopefulness of the Declaration, and bringing that energy to the Constitutional Convention, James Wilson among them. So we believe it was produced here, and somehow through connections we haven't quite pieced together yet, it ended up in the town of the 3rd Duke of Richmond, who in Parliament was a really avid supporter of the American cause, as much as you could be as an MP. So his country estate is Goodwood House, which is near Chichester, and his papers ended up in the West Sussex Record Office, and this appears to be one of them. So that's a very unusual, totally different, never expected to come across kind of copy of the Declaration. But it does get at this question of, when you're reproducing the text, do you want to try to emulate the signatures, or do you just want the straight list of names because it's easier to read, right? When these men signed their names, most of them abbreviated their first name in some capacity, right? Like WM instead of William. So it's not the easiest list of names to read, and it's certainly not easy to read their signatures. So it's a very interesting parchment. It is not something that I advise talking to tour groups about because it's a very confusing document, but when I've gone to Chichester and given talks there, they love it. They love the fact that there's a connection to the American Revolution in England. They're looking forward to 2026. There's no animosity. They really love that there's this transatlantic story at play. So, sure.
When you talk about the Declaration, that's your what the action of her.
So what is the reaction to the Declaration in Europe, looking at the 1780s into the 1790s? Well, obviously there were no revolutions happening in Europe in the 1790s. I'm kidding. There were many revolutions happening in Europe. So I'll start with the immediate reception and then we'll look forward. So like I said, the Declaration is printed in Europe via London. So it spreads through European newspapers. The first, I'm pretty sure, European newspaper printing is the Leiden Gazette. And that was one of the most popular and influential newspapers at this particular moment. And I should say, the first excerpt of the Declaration. In the Leiden Gazette, they print the last paragraph. The last paragraph is the most important paragraph in 1776. I would argue it's still the most important paragraph. It's where they lay out what we as an independent country can do. We can wage war, we can accomplish peace, we can form treaties, we can do commerce. Very essential text. And it comes directly from those Virginia instructions that are passed on May 15th and Richard Henry Lee's interpretation of them. Since then, the second sentence of the Declaration has become what we think of as the most important. All men are created equal, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, consent of the governed, all of that. So if you're a European newspaper and you have to translate from English and you don't want to devote your entire 4-page newspaper to something from the British colonies, you're going to focus on the last paragraph. That seems to be the most essential part. So the Leiden Gazette, they print the last paragraph, preface it with a bunch of misinformation, stories about the Declaration in London, that it's a declaration of war, that half the delegates quit over it. There's all this misinformation that gets attached to the Declaration in London. So the Leiden Gazette, the editor of that, prefaces the last paragraph with all these other bits of information, and then says that it was signed by the famous John Hancock. And I have spent 2 years trying to figure out, is that a media literacy trick or is he trolling? Because if it's a media literacy trick, you would say the famous John Hancock to remind people, this is the guy, when you've heard of things from the United Colonies, this is the guy whose name has been attached to them, right? He's the president of the Continental Congress. But if he's trolling him, it's saying, remember that privateer, John Hancock? And that compromises the integrity of the last paragraph of the Declaration, right? So that's the first, that's in French, and that's August 20th. And that's the first appearance of the text of the Declaration in Europe. But other newspapers, printers get the text around the same time. And so you start to get these full reprints of the Declaration. And on August 30th, the Leiden Gazette prints the full translation in French as well. So I've seen at least that last paragraph reprinted in all sorts of languages, in all sorts of newspapers, Polish in Warsaw, Italian in Florence, German in Munster, all over the place. So it spreads as news. And then in November, Silas Deane, the Continental Congress's representative in Paris, he formally presents the Declaration to the Court of Versailles. And Congress hopes that this will result in an immediate alliance with the French. It takes more time than that. I don't even know if the copy originally intended for him had gotten to him quicker, if it would have made any difference, because there's a lot of considerations at play for France about whether they want to enter this war or not. So that nothing really happens formally after that presentation of the Declaration in France. Then Ben Franklin shows up. So Franklin stays here until the model treaty is ready in the fall. And then he sails over to France. Thomas Jefferson is supposed to go too, and he doesn't because his wife had a miscarriage that summer and her health is not good. But Ben Franklin shows up in the winter of 1776, 1777, and he starts sending out copies of the Declaration everywhere. And the Articles of Confederation. He has a draft of the Articles of Confederation that he prints, state constitutions that have been approved. He's just like an American PR machine in Paris. So you start to see reprints of the Declaration popping up all over the place. There's a printing of all of the state constitutions and the Declaration in French. And actually, Louis XVI had his own copy. It's still in the public library in Versailles. So there's this sort of general vernacular about the Declaration that starts to emerge through Europe. It's really important because then we see the influence of not only the concept of independence, but the rhetoric of the Declaration popping up in these European revolutions. So obviously with the French Revolution, you have Lafayette, who sails for North America very soon after he hears about the Declaration of Independence, and was clearly influenced by not only the Declaration, but his friendship with Thomas Jefferson. So there's certainly echoes of the Declaration in the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. And through the 1790s, you have other revolutions starting to happen. Poland in 1794 with Kosciuszko. There are people who are invested in the United States, but also in what the Declaration of Independence is starting to mean as a model document. And they're drawing on it, whether it's in sort of newspaper essays and pamphlets or in actual documents of state. So you almost immediately start to see the influence of the Declaration in other places. And we can trace that right through the middle of the 19th century, right through the 20th century, frankly. So it's really important to, for me at least, it's really important to know, how did people in those places first hear this news? What sort of biases or misinformation or real information did they have at that moment? Because if you think about it, if you hear a country has declared its independence, these colonies have declared independence, and it's accompanied by, well, not everyone in Congress supports it. And I think if we pay them off, then they might switch sides, especially Ben Franklin, because his son, the royal governor of New Jersey, is now in prison. And also the British fleet just landed at New York. and they have no commercial prospects. And, the list of misinformation goes on, and real information, real concerns about the longevity of the United States. So if you heard about independence in that context, you may not think of it as a model. You may not think of it as successful until you see the longevity of the United States. So the longer the United States exists, the more different independence movements and also social movements start to draw on the language of the Declaration. So it's a really good question. It's complicated because of the language issue and everything. Mhm. So the Haitian Revolution, did the Declaration have any role in that? Very complicated question. So the Haitian Declaration of Independence, the first draft of that was modeled after the American Declaration of Independence, had a lot of the same structure and rhetoric. Dessalines says, no, I want a totally different draft. So the final approved text of the Haitian Declaration of Independence is almost a rejection of the United States Declaration of Independence. It's a very different text. And it's an interesting case study because the United States is looking at all these revolutions around the world, starting with France, then we get Haiti, then we get Latin America. Meanwhile, there's Poland and Greece. There's all these revolutions cropping up, and some of them they acknowledge, and some of them they don't. So a really easy way, for me at least, to get a sense of the American sort of mind towards other revolutions is looking at newspaper reports of July 4th celebrations through time. Toasting was a really important part of July 4th celebrations. So you would have sort of a public reading and an oration and fireworks and cannons fired off. And then you would have a dinner, you go to City Tavern or wherever, and you would toast to different things. You would toast to the day, to George Washington, to the Marquis de Lafayette, right? There's like standard things that you're going to toast every year. But we start to see references to other revolutions. In 1794 and 95, to Poland. In the French Revolution, at first it's to the king, and then it's to the Republic, but always to Lafayette throughout. By the 1810s, Bolivar, Simón Bolivar to South America, May North and South America, be of one mind towards independence. So you can see that there's this sort of recognition of all these other revolutions. I have yet to find any reference to Haiti in a July 4th celebration. No toast to Haiti, no toast to Louverture, to Dessalines, no reference, not even in a negative sense, like, God, I hope we don't end up like them, right? So there's this racial element to other revolutions that we see most clearly in Haiti, though it does start to pop up in conversations about South American revolutions too. But the idea that the United States did not see themselves in the Haitian Revolution, and then the Haitian revolutionaries did not see themselves in the United States. They want a commercial treaty with the US. They want recognition. Thomas Jefferson is president at the time. He doesn't even answer the letter. So there's this sort of, neither side wants to acknowledge that the other has also declared independence and waged a revolution for very different reasons. So it's an interesting case study of a totally different kind of Declaration of Independence than the American one or other texts that are pretty strictly modeled off of the Declaration that we passed here.
The structure of the Declaration.
That's an excellent question. So did the Declaration need to be structured a certain way to be accepted by other nations? No. Like I said, there was no model. Like when the committee that was tasked with writing a model foreign treaty had that assignment given to them, they just looked at other countries' treaties and they used that as the model, right? The language is all there, the structure is all there. For the Declaration of Independence, for any Declaration of Independence, there's no model. There's no, in the Law of Nations and all the Enlightenment literature, there's ideas of what is required, of what is expected, but there's no sort of layout to follow. So what we end up with is this opening preamble that sort of lays out the stakes within human history and draws on all these Enlightenment principles of equality and liberty, and says, for all the reasons you're about to read, we had to declare independence. And then you have a list of grievances against the king. And then you have a list of grievances against Britons, saying we've also tried to reach out to our kinfolk, to our people in Britain, and they haven't answered us either. And then it says, a prince of this character, based on everything you've read so far, a ruler like this is a tyrant who doesn't deserve to be the ruler of free people. Therefore, we, the representatives of the United States, declare independence, with all of those, things in the last paragraph about the right to wage war and declare peace. And it ends with the delegates themselves committing their lives, fortunes, and sacred honor to the cause, right? So that structure seems self-evident, to use a pun, to us, because it's the Declaration of Independence that we've always known. And it has worked for other movements, whether you have the Declaration of Sentiments that uses that exact form but twists it to make their case, or you have other political independence movements that see the benefit of having a sort of preamble, articulation of rights, list of grievances, conclusion. It did not have to be that way. That's why I think starting with the May 15th resolution is so interesting. That is a much shorter text. And so when people expected, like, oh, this is the Declaration of Independence, that just shows us they didn't know what to expect. They didn't know what a Declaration of Independence would look like until they saw one. So I do give Jefferson a lot of credit for coming up with that structure that has gained so much use beyond what he ever originally intended, or perhaps what he ever hoped. Definitely a lot of other movements, labor movements, suffrage movement, a lot of social movements have drawn on that text in addition to political movements. And so it's had a long life since 1776, but it did not have to be that way. I think one of the many downsides of the text as approved is, of course, merciless Indian savages. The fact that we have a slur against Indigenous people in our founding text is something that we have to deal with. We have to confront, we have to acknowledge, especially since the first foreign people to formally acknowledge the United States were Indigenous people, not France. But I think the other problem is its length. It is a long, it's 1320 words, I think, plus the signatures. That's a long text for people to read. It takes about 8 minutes at a public reading if you go to the public reading on July 8th or anywhere else. I guess it depends on how slowly and how many huzzahs and boos interrupt you. But it takes up at least 1.5, if not 2 or 3 newspaper columns in an 18th century newspaper. These broadsides are huge posters. It's a lengthy document. It's repetitive because of the list of grievances. It's also very backward spacing, right? It's saying the king has done all of these things. And if you kind of read it through a certain lens, you can say, okay, because the king forced our governments to meet in places that were inconvenient, then as an independent country, we're not going to do that, right? You can kind of read it as if the new United States will be the opposite of everything in the list of grievances. But there's no real articulation of this is what the United States is going to be. It's just announcing we're not going to put up with this anymore and we're going to go in a different direction. So I think it probably could have been accomplished with a different structure. I think grievances probably had to be part of it because you have to defend to other monarchs that this particular monarch was bad, right? You have to convince Louis XVI that you're not totally anti-monarch. You just think that George III is a tyrant. So that makes it a difficult document to present internationally. So yeah, I think I often wonder what the Declaration could have looked like if it was written by someone else, or if it was written with different purposes in mind, if it was more of a sort of democratic writing project where everyone was contributing to not only the content, but the structure of it. If someone had just said, make it shorter. The other thing is a question that will baffle me for as long as I spend on this project. why didn't anyone translate it into French? Because not only Thomas Jefferson, Charles Thomson, the Secretary of Congress, they were all at least good enough at French that they could have translated it. But you have a bunch of French officers and engineers and different people who are streaming into Philadelphia because they want to participate in the war. This is way before Lafayette. This is before France is formally an ally. You have all these French people in Philadelphia. One of them could have translated it, and then you would have control over what the text would look like when you present it to the King of France. There's all this anecdotal evidence of Jefferson sweating every word that was cut during, July 3rd and 4th, but no one thought to translate it into French when one of the main reasons to declare independence was to get France as an ally. Instead, they told Silas Deane, when he was being sent off to take up his post in France, they said, find someone you trust to translate things into French. That's a big ask, right? You have no way of knowing for sure what someone is going to translate. And Silas Deane didn't know French well enough to double check his work. I've seen the French translation that was produced when the Declaration arrived finally to Silas Deane's hands. And every French translation is a little different. There's no consistency because it's always a different person translating it. So I have a lot of questions about if the Declaration was written, be read by other nations, right? It's presented to a candid world. Then why this structure? Why this length? Why these specific words? And why not translate it into French in the first place? So, other questions? Yeah, I was thinking we might be. Thank you all so much. Thank you very much. Really appreciate all of your questions. This is a really good conversation.
Thank you.
How y'all doing? It's good to see so many people here tonight. Yeah. Is there a member, a sign-in sheet going around? Somewhere it died because I never got it. Oh, it's Josh has it. No, oh, okay. Yeah, so I know I didn't get it. So yeah, make sure that you, if you are a guest, just indicate that for tonight. So anyway, again, thank you very much, Emily. It was very nice. So we'll just keep this short and sweet tonight. I just have a couple things to announce. You'll be seeing in the next few days a vote coming out for bylaws that we have worked on, finally have them updated. So we're going to send this out in a Google document. You'll see it from Google form from Jen for a vote. So please, take the time to read them and vote for them. July 24th, the 7th Ward Tour. I know we still don't have a whole lot of people signed up, but if you can make it, that's at 10 o'clock? Meets at Mother Bethel. Yeah, so again, let Mike know if you can make it. Let me see, what else? Carpenter's Hall, thank you. I'm gonna write that down because I want to put it in here. Carpenter's Hall needs, well, it's open, it also needs docents, right? So again, volunteer docents if you're interested in Carpenter's Hall, okay? Do they reach out to Hope? Okay, all righty. Okay, all right. So we are in need, this is always a tough one, but for anyone who can help out, nominations committee. I mean, I know it's only July, but we're going to be at December pretty quickly. We need a nominations committee. This is an election year. So we ask, it's usually a 3-person committee, people that are not going to run, okay? And your job will be to get candidates to fill the positions on the board. So the first thing you do is you ask the current board if you're going to run again. So if people run again, that makes some of it easy. And then you reach out to other people. So again, if you are interested in that, email me. We need just 3-person committee to start looking at that. Okay. And again, if you're running, even better. But if you're not, the nomination committee will, can start up. The conference in Sicily, I am happy to say that we already have 4 people attending, right? And about 4 more on the fence. So this is a great opportunity for us to kind of talk about Philadelphia, to go to Sicily, to talk and talk about Philadelphia and America 250. So we're gonna, so I encourage anyone, if you have any questions about it, the registration process, we all have torn our hair out, right? So, so it can be a little complicated, and it helps when you change it to English because you see everything in Italian. But anyway, so if plenty of time, it's not until the end of January, okay? But we do have a number of us going. Pam, you have the speaker for next August. If you want to just tell us a little bit about that person.
Hi, for the August 9th speaker will be Steve Medeiros. He's going to be speaking about Poe and his Philadelphia. Steve retired from the Poe House. He worked there for over 20 years. He's also currently at the Whitman House, so he's very interested in the history and literature. He has a small collection of Poe-related artifacts, which he's indicated he wanted to share. So, I mean, I've known Steve since I was a mere slip of a girl. So
You don't want to go there.
no. And I guarantee you it will be an interesting and an entertaining speaker for August.
Okay, thanks, Pam. One last thing, and then I'll open it up if anybody else has any announcement. We have talked, I have brought up many times about taking a Patriot Harbor cruise. I know, Charlie, you and I've talked about it forever, right? And it's like, the one I want to do is the Walnut Street to Walnut Street, which is the most of the history. So it starts on the Schuylkill and then it takes us all the way down and ends at Penn's Landing. And then we can have like a bite to eat at Liberty Point. Problem is that when I tried to do it, it's like needed names right away. So because when they told me that the best thing to do is just to grab a time and buy all the seats. So, and I was like, what do I put in, like Daffy Duck and, William Penn, and so which I would do, but anyway, but if you are interested, it's usually on Sundays. So, and I just can't give you a date right now, but if I throw out a date there, we're going to have to like jump on it. You're going to have to let me know really fast so I can buy all the tickets. So that'll be coming out probably at the end of July. I'll pick a date and we'll see. So just be prepared for it. I'll put it out in Constant Contact, but then like get right back to me if you're interested. It's usually Sundays and it'll be about, I think it's $40. So anyway, so does anybody else have anything? It's an hour and a half, I believe. You start up at Walnut Street on the Schuylkill, and I did the one to Bartram Gardens years ago, and it was really, really nice. Yeah, you've done that one too. So it's really a nice, and I mean, we don't have to do it. I just thought it would be a nice thing to do as a group since we're all history nerds and whatnot. And oh, and by the way, thank you again. If you did not go with us to the Dickinson Plantation, it was really fun. So, and we had a great little meal at a shack and ate clams and shrimp and stuff. So, but yeah, that was really a good time too. So anybody have? Book club is going to be next Tuesday. We'll send out the link Sunday night. Mary Ann, I'm going to have to ask you to run it because I'm going to be away. But I'll send out the link before I go. So, and then Pam has put out, we put out in Constant Contact a list of 5 books for you to kind of vote on for whoever's interested in reading for September. Sure.
We went down the list of possible books for the book club for September, just because our list is growing as far as books that people recommend to us. And each one is more interesting than the next. And Annie, who chairs the book club, has recommended, like, put out a list of 5 and let people vote on them. So my email is included. It's seltzermom@verizon.net. It is included in Judy's blurb about the book club. So what?
Yeah.
She was abusing me at the Dickinson plantation too. So anyway, if you just get in contact with me and tell me which of those 5 we will post as the September book club recommendation, and we'll get that to you. So again, look in the newsletter on Constant Contact. It has my email address, and just email me with your vote for the book.
Yeah, just the one that came out Monday morning.
Okay, thank you.
All right, so that's all I have. All right.